My sister Camille said, "At least I'm not desperate like her," when I showed up to her engagement party alone after another failed relationship. She was flaunting her perfect fiancé Tristan Evans, a successful architect who seemed completely devoted to her. My whole family agreed. Camille was the golden daughter with the dream life, while I was the family disappointment who couldn't keep a man. But 6 months later, everything changed. Tristan called off the wedding 3 days before the ceremony and confessed he'd been in love with me since the night we first really talked. When Camille found out, she didn't just lose her fiancé, she lost her mind. The family that once praised her perfection suddenly saw the ugly truth about who she really was. What started as her cruelest insult to me became the beginning of her complete downfall, while I finally found the love I'd been searching for all along. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Leora, and this is the story of how my sister Camille's cruelest words became the catalyst for the most unexpected love story of my life. For 28 years, I lived in her shadow, always the sister who couldn't quite measure up. While she collected achievements like trophies, I collected heartbreak like battle scars. Our parents never missed an opportunity to compare us, and Camille never missed a chance to remind me of my failures. The breaking point came at her engagement party, held at the elegant Grandfield Country Club in our hometown of Millbrook Heights. I had just ended another disappointing relationship with a man who turned out to be married, and I was feeling particularly vulnerable. When I walked into that glittering ballroom alone, wearing a dress I'd bought on sale, and carrying a gift I couldn't really afford, I felt every pair of eyes judge me before I even reached the family table. Camille looked radiant in her designer cocktail dress, her perfectly manicured hand resting on her fiancé's arm like she owned him. Tristan Evans was everything our family valued, the successful, handsome, well-educated, and completely devoted to my sister. He was a prominent architect who had designed several landmark buildings in the city, and his firm was rapidly expanding. More importantly to my parents, he came from old money and social connections that would elevate our family's status in Millbrook Heights society. That night, as I sat at the family table trying to avoid the pitying looks from relatives, Camille leaned over during the toasts and delivered the words that would change everything. Her voice was just loud enough for our cousins to hear, dripping with the condescension she'd perfected over the years. "At least I'm not desperate like her," she said, gesturing toward me with her champagne flute. "Some people just don't know when to stop trying so hard." The words hit me like a physical blow, but what hurt more was seeing our parents nod in agreement. My mother actually patted Camille's hand approvingly, while my father raised his glass higher in celebration of his successful daughter. I excused myself to the restroom, and spent 10 minutes trying not to cry in the mirror, wondering how I had become the family disappointment while Camille became their pride and joy. What none of us knew that night was that Tristan had been watching the entire exchange with growing discomfort. Later he would tell me that seeing how they treated me was the first crack in the perfect facade he'd been presented with. But at the time I just wanted to disappear, to find some way to prove that I wasn't the desperate failure they all thought I was. I had no idea that within 6 months, Camille's perfect world would crumble while mine finally began to make sense. The sister who had everything would lose it all, while the sister who had nothing would discover she'd been looking for love in all the wrong places. Sometimes the most devastating insults become prophecies in reverse, and sometimes the people who hurt us most are the ones who inadvertently set us free. My name is Leora Thandrell, and at 28 years old, I've learned that being called desperate by your own family can either destroy you or forge you into something stronger. Today I can honestly say I'm stronger, but the journey to get here was anything but easy. I work as a freelance graphic designer, which sounds impressive until you realize it means I'm constantly hustling for clients and never quite sure where my next paycheck is coming from. I live in a small but cozy apartment in the Arts District of Millbrook Heights, far from the pristine suburbs where my family resides. My place is filled with my artwork, vintage furniture I've restored myself, and plants that somehow manage to thrive despite my chaotic schedule. It's not glamorous by my family's standards, but it's mine, and I've built it entirely through my own efforts. What I don't have anymore is the desperate need for their approval that once drove every decision I made. I don't have a trust fund like Camille, or parents who pay my rent, or a social network that hands me opportunities on silver platters. What I do have is talent, determination, and a hard-earned understanding of my own worth, even if it took years of heartbreak to find it. The heartbreak part is where my family's narrative about me becomes more complicated. Yes, I've had a string of failed relationships, but not because I'm desperate or clingy, or any of the other labels they've attached to me. I've had bad luck with men because I was attracted to the wrong type, usually unavailable men, who reminded me of my father's emotional distance, or ambitious men who saw me as a temporary distraction rather than a life partner. There was James, the marketing executive, who was too busy building his career for a serious relationship, but somehow found time to date 3 other women simultaneously. There was David, the artist who claimed he needed creative freedom but really just wanted someone to pay half his rent while he figured himself out. And most recently, there was Michael, the real estate developer, who forgot to mention he had a wife and 2 kids in the next town over. Each relationship ended with me feeling smaller, more foolish, more convinced that maybe my family was right about me. Maybe I was too eager, too trusting, too willing to see potential in men who weren't ready to see value in me. The worst part wasn't the breakups themselves, it was the family dinners afterward, where Camille would offer her sympathy in that perfectly calculated way that made it clear she felt superior rather than sorry. But here's what my family never understood about those relationships. I wasn't staying in them because I was desperate. I was staying because I believed people could change, because I saw glimpses of who these men could become, and because I thought love meant fighting for someone even when they wouldn't fight for themselves. It took me years to realize that real love shouldn't feel like a constant uphill battle. My work as a graphic designer has actually been quite successful, despite what my parents think about unstable creative careers. I've designed logos for several local businesses, created marketing materials for nonprofit organizations, and even had some of my artwork featured in galleries around the city. The income isn't consistent, but it's growing, and more importantly, it's work I genuinely love. The irony is that my so-called failures in love have made me better at my job. All those relationships taught me how to read between the lines, how to understand what people really want versus what they say they want, and how to translate emotions into visual designs that resonate with audiences. Heartbreak, it turns out, is excellent training for understanding human nature. By the time of Camille's engagement party, I had been single for 3 months and was actually enjoying it. I was working on a major project for the Millbrook Heights Cultural Center, my savings account was finally showing some growth, and I was starting to feel like maybe I didn't need a man to validate my worth after all. I went to that party not because I was desperate for family acceptance, but because I genuinely wanted to celebrate my sister's happiness. That decision, to show up with an open heart despite years of subtle cruelty, would turn out to be one of the most important choices I'd ever made. Not because it led to some dramatic confrontation or moment of vindication, but because it put me in the right place, at the right time to meet someone who would see me completely differently than my family ever had. To understand how that night changed everything, you need to know the history between Camille and me, and how we became such different people despite growing up in the same house. Our parents, Robert and Elmira Thandrell, owned a successful chain of home improvement stores throughout the region, which meant we grew up with financial comfort, but also with very specific expectations about success, appearance, and social standing. From the moment we were old enough to understand, Camille and I were positioned as competitors rather than allies. She was 18 months older than me, which gave her just enough of a head start to make everything look effortless. Where I had to study hard to get good grades, Camille seemed to absorb information naturally. Where I struggled with social situations, she commanded every room she entered. Where I was emotional and intuitive, she was calculated and strategic. Our parents didn't hide their preferences. Camille was their practical daughter. The one who made sensible choices, dated appropriate men, and never caused them to worry about family reputation. I was their artistic daughter, which in their vocabulary was code for unpredictable, impulsive, and potentially embarrassing. They supported my creative interests the way you might support a nice hobby, but they never took my career seriously, or expected it to lead anywhere important. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The first real betrayal happened when I was 16 and Camille was 17. I had been dating a boy named Alex from my art class, and it was my first real relationship. He was sweet, creative, and understood my dreams in a way that felt revolutionary, after years of family dismissal. We had been together for 4 months when Camille suddenly took an interest in him. It started subtly. She would join our conversations at school, laugh a little too loudly at his jokes, find excuses to be around when he came to pick me up. Then she started inviting him to parties I wasn't invited to, introducing him to her more popular friends, and gradually making me feel like I was the third wheel in my own relationship. When Alex finally broke up with me, he was honest about why. "Camille just gets me in a way you don't," he said, as if our 4 months together had been some kind of misunderstanding. "She's more mature, more sure of what she wants." They dated for 2 months before she got bored, and moved on to someone with better social connections, leaving Alex heartbroken and me feeling like I'd somehow failed at something I didn't even know was a competition. Our parents' reaction was the most devastating part. When I tearfully explained what had happened, my mother sighed and said, "Laura honey, you can't expect boys to choose you over Camille. She's just more sophisticated." My father nodded and added, "This is a good lesson for you about not getting too attached too quickly." That was the moment I learned that in my family, love was a zero-sum game, and I was expected to accept that Camille would always win. It was also when I started believing that maybe there was something fundamentally wrong with me, some quality that made me less worthy of love and loyalty than my sister. College provided a brief respite from the comparisons, since we attended different schools. I thrived at the Millbrook Institute of Art and Design, finally finding a community of people who valued creativity and authenticity over social status. For 4 years, I believed I had escaped the family dynamics that made me feel so small. But college ended, and real life began, and suddenly I was back in Millbrook Heights, trying to build a career while living under the constant shadow of Camille's achievements. She had graduated with a business degree, and immediately landed a prestigious job at a marketing firm in the city. Within 2 years, she was promoted to account manager. Within 4 years, she was engaged to Tristan Evans. Meanwhile, I was struggling to establish myself as a freelance designer, living paycheck to paycheck, and cycling through relationships with men who seemed promising at first, but always revealed some fatal flaw. At every family gathering, the contrast between us became more stark and more humiliating. The worst part wasn't even the failed relationships. It was how my family treated them as evidence of my inherent inadequacy. When James cheated on me, my mother suggested that maybe I hadn't been attentive enough to his needs. When David broke up with me via text message, my father said I should have seen it coming because artists aren't reliable. When I discovered Michael's secret family, Camille actually said, "Maybe you attract unavailable men because you're not ready for commitment yourself." Each comment chipped away at my confidence, until I began to believe that maybe they were right. Maybe I was too needy, too emotional, too willing to excuse red flags, because I was desperate not to be alone. Maybe the common denominator in all my failed relationships was me. By the time of Camille's engagement party, I had internalized years of subtle and not so subtle messages about my worth compared to hers. I genuinely believed that she deserved her perfect life and perfect fiancé, while I deserved the scraps and disappointments I kept receiving. Her comment about my desperation felt like a statement of fact rather than an insult. What I didn't realize that night was that Tristan had been observing our family dynamics with the analytical eye of someone who designs structures for a living. He had been noticing the way conversations stopped when I entered a room, the way my accomplishments were dismissed while Camille's were celebrated, and the way I had learned to make myself smaller to avoid causing discomfort. He had also been noticing things about me that no one else seemed to see, the way I listened carefully to other people's stories, the way I found beauty in unexpected places, and the way I carried myself with quiet dignity despite the constant undermining. But I was so focused on feeling inadequate that I missed all the signs of his growing interest. That night, as I sat in the bathroom trying not to cry after Camille's latest cruelty, I made a decision that would change everything. I decided I was done trying to earn love from people who had already decided I wasn't worth it. I was done apologizing for being sensitive, creative, and hopeful. I was done believing that my sister's happiness required my misery. I didn't know it yet, but Tristan was making his own decision at that same moment. He was beginning to question whether the woman he was engaged to was someone he actually wanted to spend his life with. The months following Camille's engagement party were a study in contrasts. While she threw herself into wedding planning with the intensity of a military campaign, I focused on rebuilding my relationship with myself. The comment about my desperation had stung because it contained just enough truth to hurt. I had been desperate, but not in the way she meant. I had been desperate to belong somewhere, to feel valued by someone, to prove that I was worthy of love. Instead of wallowing in that realization, I decided to channel it into positive change. I started seeing a therapist named Dr. Sarah Whitfield, who helped me understand the family dynamics that had shaped my self-worth and relationship patterns. I threw myself into my work with renewed focus, landing several major clients, and finally feeling confident about my creative abilities. Most importantly, I stopped dating entirely, choosing instead to figure out who I was when I wasn't trying to be someone's girlfriend. Our family dinners during this period became increasingly awkward for everyone except Camille, who seemed to revel in having the spotlight entirely to herself. Every Sunday at our parents' house in the prestigious Willowbrook Estates, she would arrive with new wedding updates, vendor selections, and plans for what she called the social event of the season. My parents Robert and Elmira were in their element. Our father saw Tristan as the son he never had. Successful, ambitious, and moving in the right social circles. Our mother was already planning how to leverage the connection for her own social climbing. They had joined the Grandfield Country Club specifically because Tristan's family were founding members, and suddenly they were attending charity galas and wine tastings they previously could only dream of. Tristan is introducing us to the Havensworth family next week, my mother would announce breathlessly, referring to one of the oldest and wealthiest families in Millbrook Heights. They're looking for someone to handle the renovations on their summer estate, and he thinks Robert's company would be perfect for the job. These conversations inevitably led to comparisons about my own contributions to the family legacy. We're so grateful Camille found someone who understands the importance of building something lasting, my father would say, pointedly avoiding eye contact with me. The implication was clear: my freelance career and single status were temporary embarrassments they hoped I would eventually outgrow. What made it worse was that I genuinely liked Tristan. Unlike my sister's previous boyfriends, who had been polite but distant with me, Tristan seemed genuinely interested in my work and opinions. He would ask thoughtful questions about my design projects, remember details from previous conversations, and even refer potential clients to me when opportunities arose. During one particularly memorable family dinner, he spent 20 minutes discussing the architectural history of Millbrook Heights with me, while Camille was in the kitchen helping our mother with dessert. I mentioned that I was working on a project, documenting the city's historic buildings through photography and digital illustration, and his eyes lit up with enthusiasm. The Old Meridian Theater is one of my favorite examples of Art Deco architecture in the region, he said, leaning forward with genuine interest. Most people drive right past it without noticing the incredible detail work in the facade. Have you captured that building yet? For the first time in months, I felt truly heard by someone in my family circle. I have some preliminary sketches, but I've been struggling to get the permission I need to photograph the interior spaces, I admitted. Without hesitation, he pulled out his phone. I know the owner. Let me make a call. Within minutes, he had secured not just permission but a personal tour from the building's restoration architect. This is exactly the kind of project that should be documented, he said warmly. Historic preservation is so important, and your artistic perspective will capture things that technical drawings miss. Camille returned from the kitchen just as he was explaining the building's significance, and I saw something flash across her face that I didn't recognize at the time. A combination of irritation and something that looked almost like fear. Are we seriously talking about old buildings again? She said with a laugh that sounded forced. Tristan, honey, you know how Leora gets obsessed with these little hobby projects. The dismissal was swift and familiar, but this time someone pushed back. It's not a hobby project, Tristan said firmly. It's important cultural documentation. Leora is creating something that will have lasting value for the community. I felt my cheeks flush with surprise and gratitude. No one in my family had ever defended my work like that, especially not in front of everyone else. Camille quickly changed the subject to cake tastings and flower arrangements, but the moment lingered in the air like an unspoken challenge to the family's established. Over the following weeks, Tristan began reaching out to me directly about professional opportunities. He recommended me for a logo design project with one of his clients, a boutique hotel that was opening in the historic district. He connected me with the Millbrook Heights Historical Society, which led to a paid commission to create a series of illustrations for their annual publication. Most surprisingly, he started inviting me to networking events, where I could meet potential clients. "You should come to the Urban Planning Society mixer next Thursday," he said, during one of his visits to our parents' house. "There are several developers there who are always looking for creative marketing materials, and your aesthetic would be perfect for their projects." Camille's response was immediate and sharp. "Leora doesn't really do the networking thing," she said dismissively. "She's more comfortable working alone." But Tristan looked directly at me. "What do you think? Are you interested?" For the first time in years, someone was asking me what I wanted instead of telling me what I was capable of. "I would love to go," I said, surprising myself with the firmness in my voice. That event changed everything for my career. I met 3 potential clients, made connections with several other freelancers who began referring work to me, and most importantly, I began to see myself as someone who belonged in professional spaces. Tristan introduced me to people as an incredibly talented graphic designer rather than Camille's sister, and the difference in how others treated me was remarkable. But the professional opportunities were just the surface of what was happening. Each interaction with Tristan revealed more about his character, and more about the growing disconnect between who he was and who my family thought he was. He was thoughtful where they saw status, creative where they saw profitable, and increasingly drawn to authenticity in a world that often rewarded superficiality. Meanwhile, Camille was becoming more controlling and demanding as the wedding approached. She expected constant attention and validation for every decision, from the shade of ivory for her dress to the font choice for the invitations. She had opinions about everything and everyone, most of which involved criticizing people for not meeting her increasingly impossible standards. "The florist is being completely unreasonable about the centerpiece height," she would announce dramatically. "Clearly she doesn't understand that this isn't just any wedding this is going to be featured in Millbrook Monthly magazine." The caterer had the audacity to suggest that some guests might have dietary restrictions, she would complain. "If people can't eat what we're serving, they shouldn't come to our wedding." "The photographer wants to include some candid shots of the family," she would scoff. I told him we only want posed portraits where everyone looks perfect. What I began to notice, and what I think Tristan was noticing too, was that every conversation with Camille became about her preferences, her vision, and her disappointment with other people's failure to meet her expectations. There was no room for collaboration, compromise, or consideration of others' needs and feelings. The contrast between her behavior and his was becoming more apparent at every family gathering. While she demanded the spotlight, he quietly made sure everyone felt included. While she criticized the restaurant, the service, or the other diners, he found something positive to appreciate. While she talked about herself constantly, he asked thoughtful questions about other people's lives and actually listened to the answers. By the time spring arrived, and the wedding was just 2 months away, I was thriving professionally and personally in ways I never had before. My therapy sessions had helped me understand that my worth wasn't determined by my family's approval or my relationship status. My career was finally gaining momentum, thanks to the connections and confidence I had built. And for the first time in my life, I felt like I knew who I was outside of my role as the disappointing daughter. What I didn't realize was that my growth and confidence were having an unintended effect on the man who was supposed to marry my sister. The more comfortable I became in my own skin, the more attractive I became to someone who valued authenticity over perfection. The more I focused on building a life I loved rather than a life others expected, the more appealing I became to someone who was beginning to question whether his own life choices reflected his values or just his desire to meet external expectations. The stage was set for a confrontation none of us saw coming, but all of us had been unconsciously preparing. Camille's cruelty was about to backfire in the most spectacular way possible, and the family dynamics that had shaped all of our lives were about to be permanently altered. The unraveling began at what should have been the most celebratory moment, Camille's bridal shower. My mother had insisted on hosting it at the Grandfield Country Club, the same venue where Camille's engagement party had taken place. The guest list included 50 of Millbrook Heights' most prominent women, from longtime family friends to wives of Tristan's business associates. No expense was spared, from the imported French champagne to the elaborate floral arrangements that probably cost more than I made in a month. I had volunteered to help with the planning and setup, partly because I wanted to support my sister despite our complicated relationship, and partly because my mother had made it clear that my participation wasn't optional. "Family occasions require family support," she had said in that tone that brooked no argument. "Whatever personal feelings you might have need to take a back seat to what's best for everyone." The morning of the shower, I arrived early to help arrange the gift tables and coordinate with the catering staff. I was wearing a simple but elegant navy dress that I had splurged on for the occasion, and I had actually felt confident about my appearance for once. My work had been going so well that I could afford nice things without guilt, and my therapy sessions had helped me stand straighter and smile more genuinely. Camille arrived fashionably late, looking absolutely stunning in a white silk dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent. She was in her element, graciously accepting congratulations and admiration from the gathered guests. For the first hour, everything went perfectly according to plan. The games were entertaining, the food was delicious, and Camille glowed with the kind of happiness that comes from being the center of positive attention. But as the afternoon progressed, I began to notice subtle changes in the dynamic. Several of the younger guests, women who knew Tristan professionally or socially, seemed more interested in talking to me than to the bride-to-be. They asked about my work, complimented my dress, and invited me to join their conversations about art, travel, and current events. Topics that Camille typically dismissed as boring intellectual stuff. The turning point came when Mrs. Eleanor Havensworth, the elderly matriarch of one of Millbrook Heights' founding families, approached me near the gift table. She was the kind of woman whose approval could open doors and whose disapproval could close them, someone my parents had been trying to impress for months. "You must be Leora," she said with a warm smile that surprised me. "Tristan has told me so much about your work documenting our city's architectural heritage. I understand you're creating a visual history project that will be invaluable for future generations." I was stunned that Tristan had mentioned me to her, let alone described my work in such glowing terms. "Thank you, Mrs. Havensworth. The project has been incredibly rewarding, and I'm hoping it will help people appreciate the beautiful details in buildings they pass every day." "How wonderfully authentic," she said, her eyes twinkling with approval. "It's so refreshing to meet a young person who understands that true value comes from contributing something meaningful to the world, rather than just acquiring expensive things." The comment was clearly intended as praise for me, but it was also an implicit criticism of the materialistic values that had defined the entire shower. Several nearby guests had overheard the conversation, and I saw them nodding in agreement. For the first time in my life, I was being publicly validated by someone whose opinion mattered more than my family's. Camille had been watching the exchange from across the room, and I saw her expression shift from confusion to irritation to something darker. She made her way over to us with a bright smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Mrs. Havensworth, how lovely to see you," she said, inserting herself into our conversation with practiced social grace. "I hope you're enjoying the party. We've tried to make sure every detail is perfect." "It's a beautiful event, dear," Mrs. Havensworth replied politely. "Your sister and I were just discussing her fascinating work. You must be so proud of her artistic achievements." Instead of agreeing or showing any sisterly pride, Camille laughed in a way that made my stomach clench with familiar dread. "Oh, Leora's always had such interesting hobbies. We've learned not to take them too seriously. You know how artists can be, always dreaming about unrealistic projects." The dismissal was swift and brutal, designed to put me back in my place while maintaining her social facade. But Mrs. Havensworth's eyebrows rose in surprise, and her expression cooled noticeably. "I hardly think documentation of historic architecture qualifies as a hobby," she said stiffly. "The Historical Society considers it quite important work. In fact, they've asked her to expand the project to include several buildings that my late husband helped preserve." Camille's smile became strained, but she pressed on. "Well, of course everyone's entitled to their little creative outlets. I just think it's important to be realistic about what constitutes a real career versus a pleasant way to spend one's free time." The conversation was attracting attention from other guests, and I could feel the familiar heat of humiliation rising in my cheeks. This was exactly the kind of public diminishment that had happened countless times before, the casual cruelty disguised as sisterly concern. But this time, something inside me refused to accept it. "Actually," I said, my voice steadier than I expected, "it's my full-time career and it's been quite successful this year. I've had the opportunity to work with several prominent clients, including some who were referred by Tristan." The mention of her fiancé's name in connection with my success clearly struck a nerve. Camille's composure slipped for just a moment, revealing a flash of genuine anger before she regained control. "Well, yes, Tristan is always trying to help people," she said with a laugh that sounded forced. "He has such a generous heart. Sometimes I have to remind him not to encourage unrealistic expectations in people who might be better served by focusing on more practical goals." The implication was clear. I was one of those people with unrealistic expectations, someone who needed to be managed and redirected toward more suitable pursuits. It was the same message I had received from my family for years, dressed up in polite language but carrying the same sting. Mrs. Havensworth looked genuinely offended by this point. My dear, she said to Camille, with icy politeness, I think you may be underestimating your sister's achievements. The work she's doing has already caught the attention of the State Historical Commission. They're considering her for a major documentation project that would involve several counties. This was news to me. Apparently Tristan had been advocating for my work in circles I didn't even know existed. But instead of feeling proud or grateful for her fiancé's support, Camille looked furious. How wonderful for Leora, she said, her voice tight with barely controlled emotion. I'm sure she'll find a way to make the most of whatever opportunities come her way, even if they're not quite what they seem to be. The comment was so obviously bitter and inappropriate that several nearby guests actually took a step back. Mrs. Havensworth excused herself with visible displeasure, and the other women began drifting away from our corner of the room. I stood there in stunned silence, realizing that my sister had just sabotaged her own social standing to diminish mine. But Camille wasn't finished. As soon as we had a moment of relative privacy, she turned to me with her mask completely off for the first time in years. I don't know what game you think you're playing, she hissed, but it needs to stop. This is my day, my celebration, my life you're trying to insert yourself into. Just because Tristan feels sorry for you doesn't mean you get to pretend you're something you're not. The words hit their intended target, but instead of crumbling, I felt something inside me crystallize into clarity. This wasn't about my career, or my achievements, or even Mrs. Havensworth's approval. This was about Camille's fear that she might not be the obviously superior sister anymore, that someone might see value in me that they didn't see in her. I'm not playing any game, I said quietly. I'm just living my life and trying to be proud of my work. I'm sorry if that somehow threatens you. Threatens me, she laughed harshly. Don't flatter yourself. You think because a few people were polite about your little art project that you're suddenly someone important. You think because Tristan throws you some pity referrals that you're actually successful? You're still the same desperate little sister you've always been, and everyone knows it. There it was, miss. The word that had haunted me since her engagement party, the label that had defined my place in the family hierarchy for years. But this time, instead of accepting it, I found myself questioning it. Why does it matter so much to you that I think of myself as desperate? I asked. Why can't you just be happy that I'm happy? The question seemed to catch her off guard, as if she had never considered that my happiness might be independent of her approval or disapproval. For a moment she looked almost confused. Then her expression hardened again. Because someone needs to keep you grounded in reality, she said. Someone needs to make sure you don't embarrass the entire family by overreaching. You've always been too emotional, too impractical, too willing to believe in things that aren't real. At least I'm not desperate enough to mistake pity for genuine interest. The cruelty of it took my breath away, but it also did something unexpected. It freed me from the last vestiges of my need for her approval. In that moment I realized that no amount of success, talent or external validation would ever be enough to change how Camille saw me, because her identity depended on seeing me as less than herself. You're right about one thing, I said, my voice gaining strength. I'm not desperate anymore. I don't need your approval or mom and dad's pride or anyone else's permission to value myself. And I'm done pretending that your happiness requires my misery. I walked away from her then, leaving her standing alone by the gift table with an expression of shocked anger. I made my polite goodbyes to the remaining guests, thanked my mother for hosting such a lovely event, and drove home feeling lighter than I had in years. What I didn't know was that Tristan had arrived at the club just as I was leaving. He had come early to help load gifts into his car, but instead he encountered several departing guests who were buzzing with whispered conversations about the uncomfortable scene they had witnessed between the bride and her sister. Mrs. Havensworth in particular, was quite vocal about her disapproval of Camille's behavior. Such an unbecoming display of jealousy, she told her friend loud enough for Tristan to overhear. That poor young woman has more talent and grace in her little finger than her sister has in her entire body, and yet she's treated like an embarrassment. If I were that young man, I would seriously reconsider what kind of person I was marrying. As Tristan helped load wedding presents into his car that evening, he found himself thinking about Mrs. Havensworth's words, and about the growing pattern of behavior he had been noticing in his fiancée. The woman he had fallen in love with 2 years earlier had seemed confident and successful, but lately she seemed more focused on diminishing others than on building herself up. More troubling was the realization that he had been thinking about me more and more frequently, not because he was attracted to family drama, but because I represented something authentic and kind that he was beginning to fear he wouldn't find in his marriage. That night, as he lay in bed next to a woman who was still complaining about how I had ruined her special day by receiving positive attention, Tristan made a decision that would change all of our lives forever. He was going to have an honest conversation with me about what he was feeling regardless of the consequences. Because for the first time in his adult life, he was more afraid of making the wrong choice than of making a difficult one. The phone call came 3 days after the bridal shower, at 9:30 in the evening while I was working on a logo design for a local bakery. I almost didn't answer because I didn't recognize the number, but something made me pick up on the fourth ring. Leora, it's Tristan. I hope I'm not calling too late. His voice sounded different, quieter, more hesitant than the confident architect I had come to know through family gatherings and professional networking events. Oh hi, I said, closing my laptop and trying to ignore the way my heart rate immediately increased. Is everything okay? Is Camille all right? Camille is fine, he said, and there was something in his tone that made me think he meant physically rather than emotionally. I was actually calling because I wanted to talk to you about what happened at the shower. I heard there was some kind of incident, and I wanted to make sure you were okay. The concern in his voice was genuine, and it caught me off guard. In my family, incidents involving Camille and me were typically treated as my fault or my problem to resolve. No one had ever called to check on my well-being after one of her public humiliations. I'm fine, I said automatically, then found myself being more honest than I intended. Actually no, that's not true. I'm hurt and confused, but I'm okay. Your fiancé made it clear that she considers my career and my presence at family events to be somehow threatening to her happiness. There was a long pause before he responded. Can I ask you something? And please be honest with me, even if you think it might be difficult for me to hear. Of course, do you think the woman I'm engaged to marry is someone you would choose as a friend if you weren't related to her? The question was so unexpected and so loaded with implications that I sat in stunned silence for several seconds. It felt like he was asking me to make a judgment that could have devastating consequences for my entire family dynamic. Tristan, I don't think that's a fair question for me to answer. I said finally. She's my sister, and you're marrying her in 6 weeks. Whatever issues Camille and I have are between us. But that's just it, he said, and I could hear him pacing in the background. I don't think your issues are just between you. I think they reveal something fundamental about who she is as a person, and I'm starting to realize that I may have been so focused on the idea of her as a successful, beautiful, socially connected that I never really looked at her character. The conversation was veering into dangerous territory, but I found myself unable to hang up. For years I had watched Tristan at family gatherings and wondered what it would be like to be with someone who seemed so thoughtful and kind. Now he was calling me late at night to discuss his doubts about marrying my sister, and I didn't know how to process the mixture of excitement and guilt that was flooding through me. What happened at the shower that made you want to have this conversation? I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral. He told me about the conversations he'd had with departing guests, particularly Mrs. Havensworth's comments about Camille's behavior. He told me about coming home to find Camille ranting about how I had manipulated the situation to get attention, how I was clearly jealous of her upcoming wedding, and how the family needed to do something about my inappropriate behavior. She wants your parents to disinvite us from the wedding, he said quietly. She thinks you're going to somehow sabotage the ceremony or steal focus from her big day. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. I had known Camille was angry about the shower, but the idea that she would try to exclude me from her wedding, and by extension from the family celebration, was beyond anything I had imagined. What did you tell her? I asked, dreading the answer. I told her that if you weren't welcome at our wedding, then I wasn't sure I wanted to have a wedding at all. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken implications. I could hardly breathe, let alone figure out what to say to this man who was supposed to marry my sister in 6 weeks, but was instead defending me against her cruelty. Tristan, I said finally, I think you should probably hang up now and forget we had this conversation. Whatever problems you're having with Camille, I can't be part of solving them. It wouldn't be right. What if I don't want to forget? He asked softly. What if this conversation is the first honest one I've had in months? What if talking to you is the only time I feel like I can be completely myself? The confession hung in the air between us, dangerous and thrilling and absolutely impossible. I knew I should end the call immediately, should put distance between myself and this situation that could only lead to heartbreak for everyone involved. But instead I found myself asking the question I had been afraid to even think. What are you really saying? I'm saying that I think I've been engaged to the wrong sister, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I'm saying that every conversation I've had with you has felt more real than anything I've shared with Camille in the past year. I'm saying that I'm terrified I'm about to make the biggest mistake of my life, and the only person I want to talk to about it is you. We talked until almost midnight that night, and then every night for the next week. The conversation started out focused on his relationship with Camille, but gradually expanded to include everything our childhoods, our dreams, our fears, our hopes for the future. He told me about growing up as an only son in a family that expected him to carry on traditions and make connections rather than follow his passions. I told him about growing up as the disappointing daughter in a family that never quite knew what to do with someone who valued creativity over conformity. What emerged from those late-night phone calls was a connection I had never experienced with anyone before. Tristan understood my artistic vision in a way that made me feel seen and valued. I understood his struggle between duty and authenticity in a way that made him feel less alone. We were both people who had been trying to be what others expected rather than who we actually were, and talking to each other felt like coming home to ourselves. But the secrecy was eating at both of us, especially as the wedding preparations intensified and family pressure mounted. Camille had apparently convinced our parents that I was having some kind of breakdown related to jealousy about her upcoming marriage. They began treating me with a combination of pity and frustration that was somehow worse than their usual dismissiveness. "Leora, sweetheart, we're worried about you," my mother said during one particularly awkward family dinner. "Camille mentioned that you've been acting strangely lately, and we want you to know that it's perfectly normal to feel envious when your sister is experiencing such happiness." "I'm not envious," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm genuinely happy for both of them. I just think that maybe Camille and I need some space to work through our relationship issues without involving the whole family." My father looked up from his meal with obvious irritation. "What relationship issues? Camille has been nothing but patient with your dramatics over the years. The least you can do is put aside whatever petty grievances you have and support your sister during the most important time of her life." The assumption that any conflict between us must be my fault was so automatic and absolute that it took my breath away. Even after witnessing years of Camille's casual cruelty toward me, they remained convinced that I was the problem in our dynamic. "Maybe the issue isn't petty grievances," I said, surprising myself with my boldness. "Maybe the issue is that Camille has spent our entire lives making sure I know that I'm not as valuable or worthy as she is, and I'm finally at a point where I don't accept that narrative anymore." The silence that followed was deafening. My parents exchanged the kind of look that parents share when they're dealing with a problematic person rather than a beloved daughter. Camille, who had been unusually quiet during the meal, finally spoke up. "See," she said to our parents, as if I weren't sitting right there. "This is exactly what I was talking about. She's creating these elaborate victim fantasies because she can't handle the fact that some people are just more successful than others. It's honestly embarrassing." The dismissal was so complete and so familiar that for a moment I felt myself slipping back into the old pattern of accepting her version of reality. But then I remembered Tristan's voice telling me that I was talented, valuable, and worthy of respect. I remembered Mrs. Havensworth praising my work. I remembered all the clients who had hired me because they recognized my skills and vision. "You're right about one thing," I said, standing up from the table. "This conversation is embarrassing, but not for the reasons you think." I left dinner early that night and drove to the small park where Tristan and I had arranged to meet. We had been planning these brief secret meetings for the past week, always in public places where we could talk without being completely alone together. The emotional intimacy of our phone calls was dangerous enough without adding physical proximity to the mix. He was waiting by the pond, looking as conflicted as I felt. The wedding was now just 3 weeks away, and the pressure was building from all directions. His family was throwing pre-wedding parties, his business partners were making toasts about his good fortune in marrying into such a prominent local family, and everyone seemed to assume that his increasing nervousness was just normal pre-wedding jitters. "I told my parents tonight that I don't think I'm the problem in my relationship with Camille," I said, sitting down on the bench next to him. They looked at me like I was delusional. "I've been thinking about that," he said, "about how your family treats you versus how they treat her. And I keep coming back to the same question: if you were my sister, would I be proud of you or would I be constantly trying to diminish your accomplishments?" The hypothetical hit me harder than I expected. "You would be proud," I said quietly. "Because you see people for who they really are, not for who you need them to be to make yourself feel better." He turned to face me fully, and I saw something in his eyes that made my heart race. "Leora, I need to tell you something, and I need you to let me finish before you respond." I nodded, not trusting my voice. Not because of some rebound situation or because I'm having cold feet about the wedding, but because spending time with you has shown me what it feels like to be with someone who truly sees and appreciates me for who I am. You challenge me to be better without making me feel inadequate. You support my dreams without trying to reshape them to fit your vision. You make me want to be the kind of man who deserves your respect and affection." Tears were streaming down my face before he finished speaking, because I knew that I felt exactly the same way about him. But I also knew that admitting it would change everything for both of us, and not in ways that would be easy to navigate. "I can't hear this right now," I said, even though every part of me wanted to hear it. "You're getting married to my sister in 3 weeks. Our families have been planning this wedding for months. Your confession isn't fair to any of us." "You're right," he said, "it's not fair, but neither is marrying someone I don't love while being in love with someone else. Neither is pretending that what I feel for you is just friendship or sympathy. Neither is starting a marriage based on a lie." We sat in silence for several minutes, both of us crying and both of us knowing that we had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. The conversation had moved beyond emotional intimacy into territory that would require choices with consequences we couldn't predict or control. "What happens now?" I asked finally. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I know that I can't keep living this lie. I have to make a decision about the wedding, and I have to make it soon. The only question is whether I make it based on fear and obligation or based on love and honesty." That night I went home and called in sick to work the next day. I spent hours staring at the ceiling, trying to figure out how my life had become so complicated so quickly. 3 months ago I had been the family disappointment with a struggling career and a history of failed relationships. Now I was potentially the catalyst for the biggest scandal in our family's history, and the man I was falling in love with was supposed to marry my sister in less than a month. The phone rang constantly, Camille calling to complain about wedding vendors, my mother calling to discuss final guest counts, friends calling to ask about my role in the ceremony. I let them all go to voicemail, unable to participate in the charade of celebrating a wedding that I now knew was built on a foundation of doubt and obligation rather than love and commitment. But I also knew that whatever happened next had to be Tristan's decision, not mine. I could not and would not be the person who broke up my sister's engagement, no matter how I felt about the man involved. If he decided to go through with the wedding, I would have to find a way to support that choice and move on with my life. If he decided to call it off, it would have to be because of what was right for him, not because of pressure from me. The next morning I woke up to find 17 missed calls and dozens of text messages on my phone. My heart pounded as I realized that something significant had happened while I was trying to sleep through my emotional crisis. The most recent message was from my mother, sent at 6:30 that morning, "Come to the house immediately. We have a family emergency to discuss." As I drove toward my childhood home in Willowbrook Estates, I had no idea that Tristan had spent the night making the most difficult decision of his life, and that by the time I arrived for the family meeting, the course of all our futures would already be set in motion. I arrived at my parents' house to find Camille's car already in the driveway, along with 2 other vehicles I didn't recognize. One belonged to Tristan, and the other was a sleek black sedan that looked expensive enough to belong to someone important. My stomach clenched with dread as I realized that whatever was happening inside was serious enough to require witnesses beyond our immediate family. The front door was unlocked, which was unusual for a weekday morning, and I could hear raised voices coming from the living room before I even stepped inside. Camille's voice was the loudest, shrill with an emotion I had never heard from her before. Genuine panic rather than her usual calculated dramatics. "This is completely unacceptable," she was saying as I approached the doorway. "You cannot do this to me 3 weeks before the wedding. Do you have any idea what this will do to my reputation? To our family's reputation?" I paused in the hallway, suddenly understanding that my worst fears were being realized. Tristan had made his decision, and it wasn't the one that would preserve the status quo. My hands were shaking as I took a deep breath and entered the living room to face whatever consequences awaited us all. The scene that greeted me was unlike anything I had ever witnessed in our family's carefully maintained world of social propriety. Camille was pacing back and forth in front of the fireplace, her usually perfect appearance disheveled and her face blotchy with tears and rage. Our parents were seated on the couch looking shell-shocked, my father's face gray with what I assumed was horror at the social implications of whatever had transpired. Tristan stood near the window with his arms crossed, looking resolute despite the chaos swirling around him. The 4th person in the room was Mrs. Eleanor Havensworth, sitting primly in the wingback chair with an expression of cool disapproval that seemed directed at everyone except Tristan. Her presence explained the expensive car in the driveway, but raised even more questions about what exactly had happened to require her involvement in our family crisis. Leora, my mother said when she noticed me in the doorway, her voice tight with barely controlled emotion. Thank goodness you're here, we need to discuss this situation as a family. What situation? I asked, though I was fairly certain I already knew the answer. It was Tristan who responded, his voice calm but firm. I've called off the wedding, he said, meeting my eyes directly. I came here this morning to tell your parents and Camille that I cannot in good conscience marry someone when I'm in love with someone else. The words hit the room like a bomb, even though everyone except me had apparently already heard them. Camille let out a sound that was part shriek and part sob, whirling around to face me with an expression of pure hatred. This is your fault, she screamed, pointing at me with a shaking finger. You did this, you seduced him somehow, you manipulative little witch. You couldn't stand to see me happy, so you destroyed my entire life. The accusation was so far from the truth that I almost laughed, but the raw pain in her voice kept me from finding anything amusing about the situation. Despite all her cruelty toward me over the years, I had never wanted to see her genuinely devastated. I had wanted her to treat me with respect and kindness, not to lose the things that mattered most to her. Camille, I said softly, I didn't do anything to destroy your life. I never even told Tristan how I felt about him. This decision was entirely his to make. Liar, she shrieked, you've been plotting this for months. All those innocent conversations about your pathetic little art projects, all those networking events he invited you to, all those times you showed up at family dinners looking like you were trying to impress him. You knew exactly what you were doing. Her accusation revealed how closely she had been watching my interactions with her fiancé, and how threatened she had felt by his genuine interest in my work and opinions. But it also revealed something darker, her complete inability to imagine that someone might choose me over her for reasons that had nothing to do with manipulation or scheme. Havensworth interjected in her crisp, authoritative voice, I think this young man's decision shows remarkable integrity and self-awareness. It would be far more cruel to enter into a marriage under false pretenses than to have the honesty to acknowledge when one's feelings have changed. My parents looked horrified that an outsider was commenting on our family drama, but Mrs. Havensworth's social standing meant they couldn't simply ask her to leave or keep her opinions to herself. My father attempted damage control with his usual diplomatic approach. Mrs. Havensworth, we're so grateful for your concern, but I'm sure this is just a case of pre-wedding nerves that can be resolved with some honest communication and perhaps postponing the ceremony for a few weeks. But Tristan shook his head firmly. This isn't about nerves or timing, Mr. Thandrell. This is about the fact that I realized I was engaged to someone whose values and character are fundamentally incompatible with mine. The wedding needs to be cancelled, not postponed. The finality in his voice seemed to hit Camille like a physical blow. She sank into a chair and began crying in earnest, the kind of ugly, desperate crying that she had never allowed anyone to see before. For a moment, I felt genuine sympathy for her, despite everything that had happened between us. But then she looked up at me with eyes full of venom and said something that shattered any remaining compassion I might have felt. You think you've won something, don't you? She said, her voice thick with tears but sharp with malice. You think because he's infatuated with your pathetic victim act, that you're suddenly better than me. But you're still the same desperate, needy little girl you've always been. And when he gets tired of your drama and your insecurities and your complete inability to fit into his world, he'll come crawling back to me. The cruelty of it was breathtaking, even by Camille's standards. She was willing to destroy any remaining relationship we might have had as sisters in order to inflict maximum damage on my happiness. But more than that, she was revealing exactly the kind of person Tristan had realized he didn't want to marry. Camille, our mother said sharply, clearly recognizing that her daughter was damaging her own cause. That's enough. This situation is difficult for everyone, and attacking your sister isn't going to change anything. But Camille was beyond caring about strategy or consequences. Years of believing that her beauty and social status made her inherently superior to everyone around her had left her completely unprepared for the possibility that someone might choose substance over surface, authenticity over perfection. No, it's not enough, she said, standing up and turning her fury on our parents. You two created this situation by coddling her and making excuses for her failures her entire life. You should have made it clear years ago that she needed to stay in her lane and stop reaching for things that were meant for people like me." The mask was completely off now, revealing the ugly entitlement and contempt that had always lurked beneath her polished exterior. Our parents looked genuinely shocked, as if they were seeing their golden daughter clearly for the first time. Mrs. Havensworth made a sound of disgust that was audible across the room. "Young lady," she said in a voice that could have frozen water, "your behavior today has been absolutely appalling. If this is how you treat your own family members, I can certainly understand why this gentleman has had second thoughts about marrying you." The rebuke from someone of Mrs. Havensworth's social standing was devastating to Camille, who had spent years cultivating connections with exactly these kinds of influential women. Her face crumpled as she realized that her public meltdown was being witnessed by someone who could destroy her reputation with a few well-placed comments at the right social gatherings. "Mrs. Havensworth," my father said desperately, "surely you understand that this is an extremely emotional situation for our family." Camille isn't herself right now, but the older woman stood up with an expression of cold finality. "On the contrary, Mr. Thandrell, I think your daughter is showing us exactly who she is. And frankly, it explains a great deal about the family dynamics I've observed over the past several months." She turned to Tristan with a look of approval. "You've made the right decision, young man. Character matters far more than social connections or surface attractions. I suggest you focus on building a relationship with someone who shares your values rather than someone who simply looks good on paper." Her pointed look at me left no doubt about who she thought he should be building that relationship with. The implicit endorsement from one of Millbrook Heights' most respected matriarchs was both thrilling and terrifying, because it meant that our secret feelings were apparently more obvious than we had realized. After Mrs. Havensworth left, the family meeting devolved into accusations, recriminations, and desperate attempts at damage control. My parents tried to convince Tristan that Camille had just been under too much stress, and that she didn't mean the horrible things she had said. They offered to pay for couples counseling, to postpone the wedding indefinitely, to do whatever it took to salvage the relationship that represented their entree into Millbrook Heights high society. But Tristan was unmoved by their pleas. "I understand that this creates difficulties for your family," he said with genuine sympathy. "But I can't marry someone I don't love, and I can't pretend that what I witnessed today was just stress." The way Camille spoke to and about Leora revealed something fundamental about her character that I can't ignore. Camille made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation by promising to be nicer to me, to go to therapy, to change whatever needed to be changed. But her promises rang hollow after the vicious mask-off moment we had all witnessed. "It's too late for promises," Tristan said quietly. "This isn't about one bad day or a moment of stress. This is about a pattern of behavior that shows me who you really are when things don't go your way. I can't build a life with someone who treats the people she's supposed to love with such contempt." The next few hours were a blur of logistical nightmares and social catastrophes. Phone calls had to be made to cancel the venue, the caterer, the florist, and the photographer. Invitations had to be sent to 200 guests explaining that the wedding was called off. Wedding gifts had to be returned, deposits had to be written off, and explanations had to be crafted for the inevitable questions and gossip. My parents were devastated, not just by the loss of the wedding they had been planning, but by the social humiliation of having to explain to their friends and business associates why their daughter's engagement had ended so abruptly. The story would spread through Millbrook Heights society like wildfire, and they knew that their carefully cultivated reputation would suffer significant damage. But the most devastating consequence for them was the realization that their golden daughter, the one they had always been so proud of, had revealed herself to be someone they didn't recognize or particularly like. The cruel things Camille had said to me in front of witnesses forced them to confront the uncomfortable truth that they had enabled and celebrated behavior that was fundamentally unkind. Camille herself seemed to cycle through different emotional states throughout the day. Rage at me for stealing her fiancé, bargaining with Tristan to reconsider his decision, denial that the wedding was really cancelled, and finally a kind of bitter acceptance that her perfect life had crumbled in the space of a single morning. "You realize this isn't over," she said to me as we stood in the kitchen later that evening, after most of the immediate crisis management had been handled. "You think because you won this round that you've proven something about yourself, but you're still the same pathetic person you've always been, and everyone will see that eventually." The threat was empty and we both knew it, but it represented her final attempt to maintain some sense of superiority in a situation where she had lost everything that mattered to her. I felt a mixture of pity and relief as I looked at my sister, finally seeing her clearly for who she really was, rather than who I had always wished she could be. "I never wanted to win anything from you, Camille," I said softly. "I just wanted you to love me the way sisters are supposed to love each other. But I understand now that you're not capable of that, and that's not my fault or my responsibility to fix." As I drove home that evening, I reflected on the surreal turn my life had taken in the space of just a few months. The sister who had spent years calling me desperate had revealed herself to be the truly desperate one, willing to say or do anything to maintain her position of superiority. The family that had always treated me as the disappointment was now forced to confront the uncomfortable truth that their favorite daughter was capable of breathtaking cruelty. Most importantly, the man I had fallen in love with had chosen authenticity over obligation, kindness over social status, and me over the woman he was supposed to marry. The vindication was complete, but it came at a cost that would reshape our family forever. My phone rang as I pulled into my apartment complex, and I saw Tristan's name on the display. For the first time in weeks, I could answer his call without guilt or secrecy. "How are you holding up?" he asked, his voice gentle with concern. "I honestly don't know," I admitted. "Today was the most intense day of my entire life. I feel vindicated and guilty, and excited and terrified all at the same time." "I know the feeling," he said, "but I want you to know that I don't regret my decision, even knowing how much pain it's caused. I couldn't have lived with myself if I had gone through with that wedding." "What happens now?" I asked, echoing the question I had posed in the park just a few days earlier. "Now we take things slowly, and see if what we feel for each other can survive in the real world, without the secrecy and the forbidden nature of it," he said. "Now we find out if we can build something genuine together, despite the complicated way it began." As I hung up the phone and headed upstairs to my apartment, I realized that for the first time in my life, I was about to find out what it felt like to be chosen first, to be valued for who I truly was, rather than who someone needed me to be. The family dynamics that had shaped my entire identity were permanently altered, and the sister who had defined herself by her superiority over me was now faced with rebuilding her life from scratch. The vindication was everything I had never dared to dream of, but it came with the sobering realization that some relationships, once broken, could never be fully repaired. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and consequences, but tonight I was simply grateful to be free from the desperate need for approval that had defined so much of my life. 6 months after the wedding that never happened, I was sitting in my newly expanded apartment, which I had been able to afford thanks to the steady stream of clients that had come from my growing reputation in Millbrook Heights. The morning sun was streaming through the large windows of what was now my dedicated studio space, illuminating the architectural drawings and digital designs that covered my work table. My historic documentation project had evolved into something much larger than I had ever imagined, with funding from the State Historical Commission and interest from publishers who wanted to turn it into a coffee table book. The transformation in my life over those 6 months had been remarkable, but it wasn't the kind of dramatic overnight change that happens in fairy tales. It was the slow, steady growth that comes from finally understanding your own worth and refusing to accept less than you deserve from the people in your life. Tristan and I had taken our relationship slowly, as we had promised each other that night after the family confrontation. We were both aware that our connection had developed in the intense, secretive circumstances of his engagement to my sister, and we needed to discover whether it could survive in the normal world of everyday challenges and ordinary moments. The answer, it turned out, was a resounding yes. What I discovered about love with Tristan was completely different from anything I had experienced in my previous relationships. There was no desperate need to prove my worth, no constant anxiety about whether I was enough, no exhausting effort to be someone I wasn't in order to keep his interest. Instead, there was a steady foundation of mutual respect, shared values, and genuine enjoyment of each other's company. He supported my career ambitions without trying to manage or redirect them, celebrated my successes without feeling threatened by them, and encouraged my growth without making me feel like I needed to change to be worthy of his love. In return, I was able to offer him the kind of authentic partnership he had been missing in his relationship with Camille, someone who loved him for who he truly was rather than what he represented or provided. Our first public appearance as a couple had been at the Millbrook Heights Cultural Center Gala, where my architectural documentation work was being featured in a major exhibition. I had been nervous about the social implications of our relationship, knowing that the story of how we got together would be the subject of considerable gossip and speculation. But Mrs. Eleanor Havensworth had made a point of publicly congratulating us at the event, telling anyone who would listen that we were a perfect match of shared values and mutual admiration. Her endorsement had effectively neutralized most of the potential social backlash, transforming our relationship from a scandal into a romance that the community's most influential members found charming and appropriate. "True love will always find a way," she had announced to the assembled guests during her speech about supporting local artists. "And when two people are as clearly suited for each other as these young people are, we should celebrate their happiness rather than dwelling on the unfortunate circumstances that brought them together." The professional success that had followed was gratifying, but it wasn't the most important change in my life. The most important change was internal, Miss said, the shift from seeking validation from others to finding confidence in my own judgment and worth. I no longer needed my family's approval to feel successful, no longer needed external recognition to believe in my talents, and no longer needed a romantic relationship to feel complete as a person. This new foundation of self-respect had allowed me to set boundaries with my family members that would have been impossible for the person I used to be. The boundaries weren't born from anger or revenge, but from a clear understanding of what kinds of relationships were healthy for me and what kinds were not. My parents had struggled to accept the new dynamic, particularly my refusal to pretend that nothing significant had changed in our family relationships. They wanted to return to the old patterns where family peace was maintained by my willingness to absorb Camille's cruelty without complaint, where family gatherings could continue as long as I accepted my designated role as the disappointing daughter. But I was no longer willing to play that role, and my refusal created an uncomfortable mirror that forced them to confront their own behavior over the years. The conversation we had 2 months after the cancelled wedding was one of the most difficult but necessary discussions of my life. "We just want our family to be whole again," my mother had said during one of our increasingly strained dinners. "Whatever happened between you and Camille, surely you can find a way to move past it for the sake of family harmony." "The problem isn't what happened between Camille and me," I had replied, my voice calm but firm. "The problem is what has been happening between all of us for years." Camille's cruelty toward me didn't exist in a vacuum. It was enabled and encouraged by a family system that treated her happiness as more important than my dignity. My father had shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "We never encouraged anyone to be cruel, Leora. We just tried to keep the peace and help both our daughters succeed in their own ways." "But that's not what happened," I had said, pulling out my phone to show them screenshots I had saved of family text message conversations over the years. "Look at these messages from family gatherings, where Camille said horrible things about me. Look at your responses. You never once told her that her behavior was inappropriate. You never once asked her to apologize or change how she treated me. Instead, you consistently told me that I was being too sensitive, or that I should try to understand her perspective." The evidence was uncomfortable and undeniable. Years of casual cruelty had been documented in our own family communications, along with my parents' consistent pattern of excusing Camille's behavior while expecting me to absorb it without complaint. "We thought we were helping you develop thicker skin," my mother had said weakly. "We thought if you learned not to take things so personally, you would be better equipped for the real world." "What you actually taught me," I had replied, "was that my feelings didn't matter, that my achievements weren't valuable, and that love within our family was conditional on my willingness to accept mistreatment." It took me 28 years to unlearn those lessons, and I'm not going back to that dynamic. The conversation had ended with my parents promising to think about what I had said, but real change was slow and sometimes inconsistent. They were genuinely trying to treat me with more respect, and to acknowledge my accomplishments more readily, but years of ingrained patterns don't disappear overnight. What had changed completely was my expectation that they would automatically prioritize my emotional needs or validate my experiences. I no longer waited for their approval to feel good about my achievements, no longer sought their understanding to feel justified in my decisions, and no longer tolerated disrespectful behavior in the name of family loyalty. The relationship with Camille herself had evolved into something that could best be described as cordial distance. She had eventually apologized for her behavior on the day of the canceled wedding, but the apology felt more like damage control than genuine remorse. She had moved to another city shortly after the scandal, taking a job with a marketing firm that specialized in crisis management, a career choice that struck everyone who knew her as ironically appropriate. Our interactions were now limited to major family occasions, and even then, we maintained polite but superficial conversation. There was no longer any pretense that we had a close sisterly relationship, but there was also no ongoing drama or conflict. We had simply acknowledged that we were two very different people who happened to share parents and a complicated history. I think the saddest part, I had told Tristan during one of our long evening walks through downtown Millbrook Heights, is that I grieved the sister relationship I never actually had. I spent so many years hoping that Camille would eventually see me as someone worthy of love and respect, but the person I was grieving was someone who never really existed. But look what you gained by letting go of that hope, he had replied, taking my hand as we passed the historic Meridian Theater, which was now featured prominently in my published work. You gained the ability to have authentic relationships with people who actually do see your worth. You gained professional success, based on your real talents. You gained the confidence to set boundaries and demand respect. You gained me, he was right, of course. The life I had built in the aftermath of that family crisis was more fulfilling than anything I had achieved while trying to earn love from people who were determined not to give it. My work had gained national recognition, with my architectural documentation project being featured in preservation journals and museum exhibitions across the region. I had been invited to speak at conferences about the intersection of art and historical preservation, had been commissioned for projects in 3 different states, and had developed a waiting list of clients who specifically sought out my aesthetic vision. More importantly, I had developed friendships with people who valued authenticity over social status, who supported each other's dreams rather than competing for limited approval, and who understood that real love involves celebrating others' successes rather than feeling threatened by them. The relationship with Tristan had deepened into something I had never thought possible. We challenged each other intellectually, supported each other professionally, and enjoyed each other's company in both exciting and ordinary moments. He had proposed on the 1-year anniversary of our first official date, not with a public spectacle or elaborate plan, but during a quiet evening at home, when he simply said that he couldn't imagine building his life with anyone else. The engagement had been met with overwhelming support from the people who mattered most to us, though it had undoubtedly reopened old wounds within my family. Camille's response had been typically self-centered, a text message congratulating us, while also mentioning her own recent promotion and new relationship with a lawyer she had met through work. The message was classic Camille, unable to let anyone else have a moment of pure celebration without inserting herself into the narrative. But her response no longer had the power to hurt me, because it no longer mattered to me whether she could genuinely celebrate my happiness or not. I had learned to find joy and validation in relationships with people who were capable of authentic love, rather than wasting energy trying to extract it from people who were fundamentally incapable of providing it. The wedding planning process with Tristan had been completely different from what I had observed during Camille's brief engagement. Instead of elaborate displays designed to impress others, we focused on creating a celebration that reflected our values and brought together the people who had supported our relationship. Instead of stress and demands for perfection, there was excitement about the commitment we were making and gratitude for the community that surrounded us. Havensworth had insisted on hosting our engagement party at the Grandfield Country Club, the same venue where Camille's engagement party had taken place just over a year earlier. The symbolism was not lost on anyone, but it felt more like a completion of a story than a deliberate attempt to rewrite history. Full circle, Tristan had murmured to me as we stood in the same ballroom, where Camille had called me desperate, surrounded by friends and family who were genuinely celebrating our happiness. But this time you're exactly where you belong. The contrast between the two events was striking in every way that mattered. Where Camille's party had been about displaying her acquisition of the right kind of man and the right kind of lifestyle, our party was about celebrating a relationship built on mutual respect and shared dreams. Where her event had been marked by subtle competitions and social maneuvering, ours was characterized by genuine warmth and authentic connections. My parents attended and behaved appropriately, though I could see the sadness in their eyes as they grappled with the reality that their vision of family harmony was forever altered. They were proud of my professional success, and appeared to genuinely like Tristan, but there was an underlying melancholy about the way our family relationships had evolved. Camille did not attend, which was probably best for everyone involved. She sent a generous gift and a gracious note, but we all understood that her presence would have created uncomfortable tensions that no one wanted to navigate on what should have been a purely joyful occasion. As I stood in my studio on that sunny morning, 6 months after the cancelled wedding, reviewing the layout for my upcoming book and planning my next photography expedition, I reflected on the incredible journey that had brought me to this point. The woman who had once been described as desperate by her own sister was now someone who inspired others, who contributed meaningfully to her community, and who had found love with someone who valued her exactly as she was. The phone rang, interrupting my thoughts, and I saw Tristan's name on the display. He was calling from a job site where he was overseeing the restoration of a historic courthouse, and I could hear construction noise in the background. "How's the most talented architectural photographer in the state?" he asked, his voice warm with affection and pride. "She's wondering if her incredibly handsome and successful fiancé wants to grab lunch at that new cafe near the courthouse," I replied, smiling as I saved my work and reached for my camera bag. "Always," he said. "I have something exciting to tell you about a project that came up in this morning's meeting. It involves documenting historic buildings in 4 different cities, and I may have mentioned that I know someone who would be perfect for the job." As I walked toward my car, preparing to meet the man I loved for lunch, and to hear about another opportunity that had come from the professional reputation I had built through my own talents and efforts, I thought about how dramatically my life had changed. The family that had once seen me as a disappointment now had to acknowledge my success, even if they didn't fully understand how I had achieved it. The sister who had called me desperate was now rebuilding her own life after losing the things she thought defined her worth. Most importantly, I had learned that real love, whether romantic, familial, or friendship, should never require you to make yourself smaller, to accept cruelty, or to apologize for your authentic self. The people who are meant to be in your life will celebrate your growth, support your dreams, and respect your boundaries. Everyone else is showing you exactly how much space they deserve in your heart. The woman who had once been called desperate by her own sister had discovered that the only thing she had ever been desperate for was the respect and love she deserved all along. And once she stopped looking for it in the wrong places, she found it everywhere that mattered. 3 years later, the autumn sunlight filtered through the tall windows of our renovated Victorian home, as I put the finishing touches on my latest project, a comprehensive visual history of small-town architecture across New England, that would be published by a prestigious university press next spring. The house that Tristan and I had bought and restored together perfectly embodied everything we valued: historic character preserved with modern functionality, beauty that came from craftsmanship rather than expense, and spaces designed for both creative work and comfortable living. My studio occupied the entire 3rd floor, with custom-built storage for my photography equipment and drawing tables positioned to catch the best natural light. Below, Tristan's home office allowed him to work on residential projects that focused on historic preservation and sustainable design. We had created a life that reflected our shared commitment to meaningful work, rather than impressive status symbols. The phone rang as I was organizing contact sheets from my latest photography trip, and I smiled when I saw my mother's name on the display. Our relationship had evolved considerably over the past 3 years, though the progress had been gradual and sometimes inconsistent. "Laura, darling, I just saw the article about your book in the arts and culture section of the newspaper," she said, her voice carrying genuine pride that would have been impossible to imagine during my childhood. "Your father and I are so proud of what you've accomplished. We always knew you were talented." The revisionist history still stung occasionally, but I had learned to accept my parents' need to reframe the past in ways that allowed them to feel better about their previous behavior. What mattered more was that they were making genuine efforts to support my current endeavors, and to treat me with the respect I deserved. "Thank you, Mom. The book tour is going to keep me pretty busy this winter, but I'm excited about it. How are you and Dad doing?" "We're well. Your father's business is thriving. Partly thanks to all the referrals from Tristan's architectural clients. It's wonderful how these professional connections have worked out for everyone." This was her way of acknowledging that my marriage had brought concrete benefits to the family, something she could never have imagined when she was worried about my inability to find and keep a suitable man. The irony wasn't lost on either of us, though we never discussed it directly. "And how is Camille?" I asked, as I always did during these conversations. My sister had become a neutral topic between us, someone we could discuss without emotional intensity, like a distant relative whose life we followed with polite interest but no deep investment. She's doing well in Boston. Her marketing firm just landed a major contract with a technology company, and she seems happy with that lawyer she's been dating. Daniel, I think his name is. She mentioned that they might be getting engaged soon. The news didn't create any emotional reaction in me, beyond mild happiness that Camille had apparently found professional and personal stability. We exchanged Christmas cards and birthday texts, but we had never attempted to rebuild the sister relationship that had been damaged beyond repair. Some relationships, once broken by years of cruelty and resentment, are better left as cordial but distant connections. That's wonderful for her, I said honestly. I hope she's found someone who makes her happy. After ending the call with my mother, I walked downstairs to find Tristan in the kitchen, preparing dinner and humming contentedly as he worked. He looked up when I entered and smiled in the way that still made my heart flutter after 3 years of marriage. "How was the conversation with your mom?" he asked, wrapping his arms around me from behind as I leaned against the counter. "Actually pretty pleasant," I said, settling back against his chest. "She called to congratulate me about the newspaper article, and she managed to do it without any backhanded compliments or suggestions for how I could improve my approach." "Progress," he said, kissing the top of my head. "Slow progress, but progress nonetheless." This was one of the things I loved most about my husband, his ability to acknowledge positive changes without minimizing the difficulties that had preceded them. He had never pushed me to forgive my family members, or to pretend that the past hadn't happened, but he celebrated each small step toward healthier relationships. "I have some news," he said, turning me around to face him. "Remember that historic preservation project in Vermont I've been hoping to get? The one with the 18th century mill complex? Of course, did you hear something?" "We got it," he said, grinning broadly. "And the best part is that they specifically requested that you handle the photographic documentation. Apparently, your reputation has reached Vermont." The joy I felt at this news was pure and uncomplicated, unmarked by any need to prove something to my family, or to validate my worth through external recognition. Success felt different when it came from authentic achievement rather than desperate striving. "That's incredible," I said, throwing my arms around his neck. "We get to work together on something beautiful and historically significant. I can't think of anything I'd rather do." As we celebrated over dinner that evening, I found myself reflecting on the strange journey that had brought us to this point. The woman who had once been called desperate by her own sister had discovered that she had never been desperate at all. She had simply been looking for love and respect in places where they weren't available. The real desperation had belonged to people who needed to diminish others in order to feel good about themselves, who couldn't celebrate anyone else's success without feeling threatened, and who mistook cruelty for strength. That kind of desperation was tragic because it was self-perpetuating. The more you hurt others to build yourself up, the smaller and more insecure you ultimately become. Later that evening, as Tristan worked on architectural drawings in his office and I edited photographs in my studio, I received an unexpected email from an address I almost didn't recognize. It was from Camille, the first direct communication we had shared in over a year. "Laura," it began, "I saw the article about your book in the Boston Globe, and I wanted to congratulate you. I know we don't talk much anymore, but I want you to know that I'm genuinely proud of what you've accomplished. I realize that I wasn't always the best sister to you growing up, and I'm working on becoming a better person. I hope you're happy. You deserve to be. Love, Camille." The message was brief but felt more genuine than any apology she had offered during the immediate aftermath of the cancelled wedding. It suggested that she had done some real reflecting about our relationship and had found the courage to acknowledge her past behavior without making excuses or asking for forgiveness. I wrote back a short but warm response, thanking her for the congratulations and wishing her well with her engagement. I didn't offer to renew our relationship or suggest that we try to become close again, but I also didn't hold on to any lingering resentment about the past. Some wounds heal better when they're left alone rather than constantly prodded and examined. As I turned off the lights in my studio and prepared for bed, I thought about the profound changes that had occurred not just in my external circumstances, but in my fundamental understanding of what it meant to live authentically. The woman who had once been called desperate had learned that true desperation was settling for relationships and situations that required you to betray your own values in order to maintain them. Real contentment came from building a life based on genuine connections, meaningful work, and unwavering respect for your own worth. It came from understanding that other people's inability to see your value was a reflection of their limitations, not yours. It came from having the courage to walk away from situations that diminished you, even when that meant disappointing people you had spent years trying to please. The sister who had once called me desperate would probably never understand that her cruelest words had actually been a gift. They had forced me to examine what I was truly desperate for, and to recognize that it was something I already possessed within myself. I hadn't needed to earn love, respect, or happiness from people who were determined not to give them. I had simply needed to recognize my own worth and to build relationships with people who were capable of seeing and celebrating it. 3 years later, surrounded by work I loved, married to a man who cherished me exactly as I am, and finally free from the desperate need for approval that had once defined my life, I could honestly say that being called desperate by my sister was the best thing that had ever happened to me. It had been the catalyst for everything good that followed. Sometimes the cruelest words become the kindest gifts, and sometimes the people who hurt us the most end up pointing us toward the happiness we never knew we deserved. The transformation from desperation to contentment isn't always dramatic or immediate, but when it happens authentically, it creates a foundation for joy that nothing can shake. In the quiet of our beautiful home, with my husband's soft laughter drifting up from the office below, and the promise of new adventures waiting in Vermont, I felt nothing but gratitude for the journey that had brought me here. Even the painful parts, especially the painful parts. After all, you can't fully appreciate the light until you've spent some time in the darkness, and you can't recognize real love until you've experienced the hollow substitute that passes for it in families and relationships built on conditions rather than acceptance. The woman my sister had called desperate 3 years ago would probably seem like a stranger to me now, and that stranger would look at my current life with wonder, hardly able to believe that such genuine happiness was possible. The transformation was complete, but the gratitude would last forever. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.